Good evening, everyone. I am Pete Carmichael, the director of the Civil War Institute, also a member of the history department here at Gettysburg College. We want to welcome you to virtual CWI conference, and it's going to be the first and only time, mark my words, that we'll do this. And I want to begin by saying that, I hope you've missed us as much as we've missed you. This made a lot of compromises we all have over the last year. We have found ways to stay in communication and to continue to explore this subject matter that we love so much. But it does not beat coming together as we do over at the Cub in that grand lecture hall, having Mr. G's ice cream, going over to the dining services, all those things that we love and that we miss so much. And I can assure you that we will be back stronger than ever. In fact, as a little teaser, I will tell you about 2022, but not until the second session. So we're so glad that you're here with us this evening. And if you've never been to CWI live in person, I hope that this will convince you to come to Adams County next year, because we would, of course, love to have you along. So let me just say a few quick announcements. The first is that after our opening panel on Carol Reardon's book, Pickett's Charge in History and Memory, we have a 15-minute break, and we will begin at 7:45 with a roundtable discussion with three battlefield guides. That will be at 7:45. These are the licensed battlefield guides, of course. That will finish our programming for this evening. We'll start tomorrow morning at 10:30. 10:30 to discuss Kent Masterson Brown's new book on Meade at Gettysburg. Here it is. And then in the afternoon, we are going to watch some footage that Ashley and myself and Jen Murray, who is behind me and to my left, that she led us on a tour of Barksdale's Brigade that finished at the Crawford Farm, is that correct? Where many of Barksdale's wounded were carried after the battle. So what will happen on Saturday afternoon, you will see elements, parts of that tour will stop, and you'll have an opportunity to ask Jen questions live and in the flesh. That finishes Saturday. And then Sunday, the final day of our virtual conference. Oh, it's not the final. Oh my God, I forgot you, Ashley. I'm so sorry. Thank God she's here. I once said she's like my Radar O'Reilly, and you still didn't know that. Did you ever look that up? Radar O'Reilly?
I think you explained it.
I explained it to you, so you didn't need to see it. Well, you also see in the film footage that I screwed up a lot of things about who's coming next at first. Yes, it was an eventful day for me. So after Jen, Ashley Luskey, right here to my right, how could I forget? We do 2 tour stops at the Rose Farm and at the Cadore House, and they are fantastic. I can't believe I forgot it. So that will finish up on Saturday. And then on Sunday, we will have Scott Hartwig. Scott Hartwig, so long ago, when was that? April?
Yes.
It was in April that Scott Hartwig, Ashley Luskey, myself, and 2 students, Cameron Sowers and Ben Roy. We spent the day at Antietam. It was bitterly cold. The morning it started, it was some flurries. And we did various parts on the battlefield. And this wasn't a traditional battlefield tour. What we did is we had some documents, photographs, and we just had a nice conversation with Scott. And so we're going to do something similar to what we did with Jen. You'll see bits of that tour, and then it'll be followed by Scott live and in the flesh, and you can ask him some questions. And that is on Sunday. All right. Just a few more quick announcements, and I will be very, very quick. We're going to have a mini CWI conference in October. I have it on the 7th. Is that correct?
The
8th, that's what I'm saying. 8th through the 10th. The 8th is a Friday evening. The theme of this mini conference is North Carolina at Gettysburg. We're going to open at the Majestic Theater. Judkin Browning, who's at Appalachia State, he's going to talk about North Carolina during the war. Judkin, by the way, is doing a fantastic study looking at the 26th North Carolina and the 24th Michigan. So that'll be Friday night. Saturday will be an all-day affair, starting with Pettigrew's attack against the Iron Brigade in McPherson's Woods. We'll move from there. Ashley, I did not forget this time, we'll be doing Iverson's assault, and then Scott Hartwig will be joining us. We'll be looking at Avery's attack, we're looking at Avery's assault on the evening of July 2nd, and then we will finish with Johnson's attack over at Culp's Hill. There'll be more details about that. I don't want to get too bogged down into the specifics, but I do want to say that there are only 105 slots open, and the registration just opened today. So I'll mention that again, and we'll send out an email about it, but we're excited to get to see some of you in person in October. Now, we do a lot at CWI that a lot of the attendees are really not aware of, and the stuff we do is with our students. We have a very energetic program that places our kids at various historical sites, mostly Civil War sites, where they gain just invaluable experience as professional historians. Ashley, who oversees the CWI Fellows Program, she takes the students down to the National Archives. She helps them with their research for our blog, which is called Killed at Gettysburg. All of that occurs because of the support that we receive from CWI attendees. As you all know, we did not charge for this event at all, but if you have the capacity and the desire, we very much would appreciate any support that you could offer, because it goes a long way in helping these young historians become professional historians down the way. And there is and I now need to look at it, I cannot see it. There is a tab that they will be able to donate, is that correct?
Yeah, there's a link that I believe Jill is going to be posting here shortly. She's just trying to get people into the room here.
So you'll see that donation tab as well, and of course I will be certain to remind everyone later in the evening about it. And now, finally, University of North Carolina Press, which is the press that publishes Civil War America. It is the press that published, I'm going to take your book right here, Carol, Pickett's Charge in History and Memory. They have been kind enough to give us, the attendees of the virtual conference, a discount. And the discount code, Jill Titus, who's behind the computer right now, she's going to type it up, and that's going to come up here in just a moment. You can use that discount code, and what kind of discount, Ashley, will the people receive?
I believe it's a 40%
40%?
Yes, which is really great.
That beats Amazon.
It does.
And you don't hear that very often, right? That beats Amazon. So 40% off, and I believe also that that's for all Carolina books. But of course, we want you to buy Carol's first and then think about the other titles. Is that right?
At least for tonight. I want you to buy mine first.
All right, you all. So I'm going to get going with our first panel on reflecting upon. Can I say classic? Does that make you feel old when I say classic?
Yes.
Well, I'm going to say it anyways. It is a classic, Pickett's Charge in History and Memory, but I want to introduce our panelists first. And I'm going to go all the way to my far left, Dowds. Doug is a resident of Gettysburg, and he and I go to the same church, Christ Lutheran Church as well. Doug is currently a professor in the Department of Military Strategy, Planning, and Operations at the U.S. Army War College. He is a retired Marine colonel and a Gettysburg licensed battlefield guide. He holds degrees in history, political science, as well as a master's in strategic studies. If I recall correctly, you did your undergraduate at Wake Forest?
I did.
You did at Wake Forest as well. Now, he also was a fighter attack pilot by trade and a graduate of the Navy Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun. Is that correct? I got that right? There is a rumor in town that the character of Tom Cruise playing Top Gun is based loosely on you.
Too much hair, not true.
It is not true.
First myth of the night.
You know what? I would not blow up that myth, and I would not blow that up. All right, so thank you, Doug, for joining us. To my immediate right, we have Ashley Whitehead Luskey. Ashley is a graduate of William & Mary. She did her undergrad. She then went on to West Virginia University, where she completed her PhD. During that time, she was a park historian / interpreter at Richmond National Battlefield Park. She did a number of important things there in broadening the interpretation at Richmond, not just on the battlefield, but also in this town. And Ashley is finishing a book based on her dissertation, looking at elite women in Richmond. And to the other side of Carol Reardon, we have Jen Murray. Jen, you might need to pop your little head up there so they can see you. There we go. So Jen Murray is a military historian. She did her master's and PhD at Auburn University, where she studied under Ken Noe. She has published a very important book that looks at the history of the Gettysburg National Military Park, published by the University of Tennessee. So unfortunately, you can't get the discount code, but you can still buy the book.
Right.
Is it in paperback yet?
Yeah.
It's in paperback as well. Jen cut her teeth as a historian right here at Gettysburg National Battlefield Park. And she is, as many of you know, a fan favorite. She gives fantastic tours, and you'll get to see that tomorrow when she does Podoxburg. And now finally, Carol Reardon. Carol Reardon spent much of her academic career at Penn State University, where she was the George Winfrey Professor. Got that right? The George Winfrey Professor at Penn State. Among her many books that she has done, keep showing you this, Pickett's Charge, of course. She also did, it's a fantastic book, With a Sword in One Hand and Jomini in the Other, The Problem of Military Thought in the Civil War. Was that based on lectures?
That was based on the Bros lectures up at Penn State.
Based on the Bros lectures. She is now retired. She is my neighbor. We talk about power tools. We talk about bark, mulch,
Gardening.
and gardening, all kinds of domestic things. And she also is teaching in the Civil War Era Studies program here. She is immensely popular with our students. And I mean, I couldn't be happier to have Dr. Reardon, because Dr. Reardon was on my master's thesis. I barely slipped by, barely got by, barely, just barely. But it's great to have our colleague. But Carol, I'll sort of misled you a little bit about tonight. This actually is not going to be about your book. It's going to be a roast. It's going to be a roast like Blackfin. Remember Blackfin?
Yeah,
I mean, these youngsters won't remember that at all. It's going to be
but
like,
I do.
you do. Do you remember Ruth Buzzy?
Do you remember that the grades can be taken away?
I didn't realize that. I didn't realize that. But I thought maybe a Ruth Buzzy imitation. You remember what Ruth did?
Yeah,
Yeah, she would get
and I can reach you from here.
you know, but why pick on the, soft academic? Go after the green. That's what
I'm not stupid.
All right. Well, let's get started here. And again, how the format's going to go for this evening is that our panelists, they're going to talk for a few minutes, 5 minutes, maybe a little bit more about Carol's book. Carol will get an opportunity to respond, and then we're going to open it up to you at home. So, do I have any volunteers? That's always a bad thing to do as a moderator, isn't it? In fact, everybody's a little bit nervous. So I'm going to say, you know what, Doug, we'll start with you if you don't mind.
Perfect. Well, first of all, I'm honored to be on this distinguished panel. I'm reminded of June Kimball standing on the morning of the 3rd, looking over the battlefield, asking, June Kimball, will you do your duty today? And then finally saying, by God, I will. I hope to do my duty tonight by talking about Carol's book. And what I really want to use as a framework that I like to use out on the battlefield, and also help me to frame much of what Carol covers in this book. And that is when looking at a battle to study the what, the so what, and the now what. The what happened? So what did it mean back then? The now what does it mean to us today? To start with the what, Carol covers, hey, what do we know? Well, we know pretty much the order of battle. We know the divisions, brigades, regiments, and batteries that participated in this attack, but we don't actually know numbers, not total on either side. We know that there's a cannonade. We don't know how long it lasts. We don't know numbers of guns on Union side nor on the Confederate side. We know that Lee gives Longstreet command of the attack, to coordinate the attack. After Carol notes, Lee had made most of the decisions already, but then when we look at the outcome, how much coordination did he actually do about the attack and the support of it? When we talk about the what part, we're actually talking about objective things. They can be quantified, pinpointed. People say we live in a post-fact world or that the truth is dead. No, it isn't. We should be skeptical of we source our facts, but facts are stubborn things. We rely upon them as signposts to guide how we determine what happened. After we've done that, we start to determine, so what? What did it mean to the people at the time? Now, there's a couple ways we can look at this. Carol points out, hey, it's a tactical feat. The Army of the Potomac repulses the Army of Northern Virginia, assault on July 3rd, and this effectively answers the question of Army of Northern Virginia advantage on day 1, the uncertainty of day 2, with the certainty of a Confederate defeat on day 3. And this leads Lee to determine that he's out of ammunition for having taken this. He is running out of supplies because his army has stayed still for nearly 3 days. And finally, he must return to Virginia. But there's also this idea that Carol goes throughout the book and talks about the impressions that people had while they were there. And let's just talk about the impressions of 2 people, Robert E. Lee and George Gordon Meade. For George Gordon Meade, he's uncertain about what this means. Certainly he knows that he's too disorganized to counterattack on the 3rd, but he doesn't know what Lee is going to do next. But let's talk about what it means to him. We're all victims and beneficiaries of our experience. Meade, who had participated in Fredericksburg, had a major role in it. It should surprise us not at all that Union soldiers are chanting Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg. So that's in his mind's eye, and now he has Pickett's charge in his mind's eye. He is starting to realize the changing character of war is that dangerous ground is becoming only more dangerous, and that the success lies in the defense. So Meade will write his wife on the 5th of July and says, I will not play their old game of attacking those Confederates in their breastworks. So he doesn't attack on the 4th. He doesn't attack at Falling Waters on the 13th of July. He won't attack at Mine Run in November either. That's what he's taken out, is the so what. For Robert E. Lee, we could ask ourselves, for someone who claims, except for a proper concert of action, we would have been successful. Okay, so what does he do about this? Well, he would say, the 3 things we need to know on a battlefield: you need to know yourself, know the environment, know the enemy. Arguably, the thing Lee knows the least about is himself. That's staff work. Does he add anything to his staff? Except for that proper concert of action, for which many people say is the problem for the Confederate Army at Gettysburg. He has no people there. His lack of artillery, or improper use of artillery, as E.P. Alexander testifies to, Lee does almost none of that. What he takes out of this, of all the thinking that goes into his staff work, it remains even after having seen Pickett's charge. It's all my fault, not a collective fault. So when we get to this part about so what, some people think it's a turning point of war. Vicksburg, Tullahoma, Gettysburg, this should be it. But we know that that changes over time. Certainly by 1864, Lincoln's not sure he's going to be nominated by his own party. We also know that Lincoln, by August, is writing the blind memorandum, pretty sure that this administration won't be reelected in the fall. So we start to move from the so what to the now what, because there's an infinite number of now whats since that event. We've now moved from trying to connect the concrete, the objective, to the subjective. And in that infinite number of now whats, between July 3rd today, the first thing they started trying to figure out is why. Whether it's the distance, the heat, the Union position, Confederate accounts, the Virginia accounts, the North Carolina, Alabama, Tennessee accounts. On the Union side, Gibbon's division, the Philadelphia Brigade. Oh yeah, and then there's Hayes' division, and of course don't forget Doubleday's. So they all have stories to tell as they try and figure out the what. Of course, it transitions over time. I think there's a wonderful quote that Carol carries in there from Michael King, and it says, societies reconstruct their past rather than faithfully recording them. This field that we know as Pickett's charge, this most dramatic account of this colossal degree of killing across the wall on July 3rd, transitions. Then now what? It becomes a site of reconciliation, of reunification. As soldiers from North and South shake hands over that wall, it changes the meaning. And whether we look at that in 1877 or 1913, that starts to be a message of what did that mean at the time. We change it all together. It transitions, and it speaks to us of the power of a story. I think that's the biggest thing I take away from Carol's book. Stories are powerful, they're cross-cultural, they're ageless. They speak to every religion, they speak to all times, they speak to all age groups. And if we just mentioned June Kimball, George Pickett, John Gibbon, Louis Armistead, Alonzo Cushing, they all have a story. Stories are powerful because they evoke images in our mind's eye, and they tap into emotion. And one of the things that Carol definitely points out is that those emotions and images evolve over time and make it worthwhile for us to continue to study Pickett's charge. So thank you, Carol.
Good?
Okay.
Sure.
So I'll start with a kind of a thought about historiography. And I always tell my students that historiography is the history of the history. And looking at Carol's book, it was published in 1997, 23 years ago now, is that right? 23 years ago?
That's why we're historians.
Right, no, Pete says classic, so we'll just, it's kind of timeless. But Carol, this book was incredibly groundbreaking for scholars in Civil War memory. And I was thinking of, we always reference David Blight's book, Race and Reunion, which is truly one of the landmark books in Civil War memory. And that book came out in 2001. So Carol's book was even predating and moving and shaping our conversation about Civil War memory before David Blight's Race and Reunion. So as a military historian, Carol certainly is a military historian, as am I think about war and memory studies. And Civil War scholars We're a little late to come to the field of Civil War memory. The World War I scholars broke into this field in the 1970s, so we were late to come to this, but truly this book is groundbreaking. And I came to it in a couple different ways. I think probably like many of my colleagues on the stage, this was on my reading list for comprehensive exams. This is one that Ken No said, you have to have familiarity with this. I looked at this when I worked here at the park and did a program on Civil War monuments because we talked about monuments and their meaning, and you have this excellent discussion in here about the Pickett's charge and the division marker that they wanted to put on the field to commemorate their actions on July the 3rd. So I used it in that way. And then, of course, writing my own book on the battlefield memory, this is one that I found myself returning to quite a lot. So it's a book that's on my shelf, it's well highlighted and dog-eared, and I get a ton of mileage out of this still so many years later. So what this book does is it looks at the memory of Pickett's charge. So Doug was talking about, you know, the different ways we look at history, and this is not like a George Stewart or an Earl Hess kind of treatment of the attack. It's a study of how we remember Pickett's charge and how the participants themselves remembered the attack on July the 3rd and how they actively shaped those memories, maligned them, misused, and distorted them. So as a good historian, I always try to identify the thesis, and Carol, I think I got your thesis in one sentence on page 3. All right, tell me if I get it. Pickett's charge holds a secure place in our national imagination, but rests on the double foundation of both history and memory. The two forces have blended together so seamlessly over the years that we cannot separate them now.
She gets an ad.
Ken No would be so proud.
Nailed it.
So in this work, the power of the newspapers, and we might have an opportunity to come back to this, looking at your bibliography, which is incredibly extensive. It should be really a model for so many of us to aspire to this kind of depth of research. How important newspapers were in shaping the memory of the attack, both northern newspapers, but particularly the Richmond newspapers, which really are the guiding force in understanding Pickett's charge. And really what your book then becomes is a study of how Pickett and those 5,600 Virginians are heralded to the forefront of this charge at the expense of Pettigrew and Trimble and all the thousands of men who walked those fields on July the 3rd. One final thought, because I know we're kind of marked on time. What I think your book does well, so the opposite of the roast, this is the toast part. What I'm really impressed with in this book, and what I think is still relevant for us today, is the way that Pickett's charge symbolizes reconciliation. And the way that you cast the charge and its memory in your final chapter goes through the Civil War centennial, how Pickett's charge still defines not only the Civil War generation, but also, you know, what is Faulkner's famous quote, you know, it's 3 o'clock.
Every Southern boy.
Yeah, every summer boy, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and how we still come to think about how about Pickett's charge. But for the years that I spent working here, people come to Gettysburg, they're gonna know about Abraham Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address, and they're likely to know a little bit something about Pickett's charge. Whether it's based in fact or whether it's based in myth and distorting of memories is something we have to disentangle. But Carol, you should certainly be commended for groundbreaking our field in Civil War memory and writing a book that still 20 years later, we're sitting here and talking about it, because this is such an important study, and I'm very grateful to be on this panel with such great scholars tonight.
All right, so I will kind of pick up on comments that both Doug and Jen have made. What fascinates me most about Carol's study and why I think it is so brilliant is the way that she unpacks the kaleidoscopic nature of the way that historical events occur, the way that historical events are perceived by actors who are engaging with them, and then the way that they are represented and remembered. She breaks it down on so many different levels to the individual soldier, talking about how variances in terrain and how swales and ridges could obscure a soldier's sightline. We often forget that. We get lost in kind of the ether and the clouds of memory and, you know, kind of romancing, well, a soldier must have had this bird's eye view or this bird's eye knowledge of what was going on in the battlefield. And in truth, that was extraordinarily rare that a soldier could be aware of or really internalize anything that's going on except for what's immediately in his front or to his side. So there's that aspect of it, that what a soldier experiences, what Pickett's charge really means. This charge happened thousands and thousands of times because thousands of soldiers making the charge experienced it, and thousands of soldiers repulsing the charge experienced it. And each one has their own story to tell. And I think that, to me, stands out as the first thing that both public historians, I think, can take away from this when giving battlefield tours. It's a way to humanize, it's a way to connect the soldier's experience to the ground, but also to kind of more, cognitive ways of representing and perceiving what they experience, but also ways for academic historians as well to connect with the individual on that kind of grassroots level. But then the way that she talks about how, the kaleidoscope of memories is formed. A soldier can only take in certain amounts of his surroundings. He usually remembers the peaks and valleys, the moments of triumph or the moments of extreme tragedy, but not really what she calls the doing of the charge itself, and how much of that gets lost. How much happens over those, swales and areas where some of these men are very much protected. They're not, under small arms fire yet. They're not under, threat of artillery shells. But that's rarely recorded or rarely represented. You see, the most intense combat at the angle. You talk about the artillery bombardments. You talk about the cost afterwards and how people made sense of that, but the actual doing kind of gets lost. And that forms the memories of how these soldiers are representing what this battle was and what it actually meant. But then you also have these competing kaleidoscopic notions formed out of cultural ideas and state loyalties and regionalities, where Virginians, of course, as Jen said, they're going to stress their own part, that they were the ones who made it the farthest. They were the bravest. The North Carolinians, they were the reason why the charge failed. They didn't support us. They didn't back us up. Then you have soldiers from Alabama, or you have soldiers from Florida or from Tennessee or Mississippi who are almost left out of the story entirely. And again, part of that is, of course, the Richmond press that Jen talked about and other reasons, cultural reasons. And you have the infighting that occurs because of that. So there's selective memories that get drawn out of that because of certain state allegiances and unit coherence. The fact that Pickett's division was composed of all Virginians versus Pettigrew's division, it had North Carolinians, but it also had men from, Tennessee, and you had men from, other states that were in that. And so there is no kind of unit cohesion in the way that there was with Pickett's men, and that also breaks down kind of these kaleidoscopic ways of the way that the battle is portrayed and then remembered. And then it's also the evolving nature of those kaleidoscopic memories that at one point in time, soldiers can say, I don't really know what to make of this battle. We always think, looking back, hindsight, well, Confederates knew this had to have been the beginning of the end for them. The war was all over. The North must have thought, well, we've definitely won the war now. And Carol highlights how that's really never the case for most soldiers on either side. In fact, they're very confused and kind of trying to figure out what exactly happened after the guns fall silent on July 3rd and what this means. And then again, as they go through the years and these political issues come in and the lost cause is being caught up in how people are remembering and representing Pickett's charge, we get even more kaleidoscopic bits coming in, shaped by memory, by time, by just the evolution of political, social, cultural ideas that are playing into it. So I think that those internal divisions, that the emphasis that Carol brings to the fact that there is no monolithic story to Pickett's charge, there's no monolithic story to any battle, to the war, even within an individual soldier's own experiences, he feels different things at the same time going into battle, or very back to back. He can feel thrilled and terrified, excited, awed, amazed, horrified. These are tiny kaleidoscopic moments that come together, that soldiers, the press, that writers, civilians back in the home front, and then of course us today, popular people, in society, are trying to make sense of, as well as artists and movie makers as well. So I think trying to tie all those things together is what's important, that Carol emphasizes all of these individual differences, and yet still, out of that, we can still form some kind of somewhat cohesive narrative while acknowledging that there is definitely no one story to Pickett's charge.
Thank you so much, Josh. Wonderful. All right, Dr. Reardon, it's your opportunity here.
I've been trying for years to get him to stop calling me Dr. Reardon, and I have failed. But I try not to make it make me feel old, but you know, I earned every stripe I got, so it's still fun, so that's why we're here. Thank you, first of all, for all of your kind comments. I actually had to sit down and reread the book in order to understand it. And you will find out in time that when you go back and read stuff that you've written, in this case, 25 years ago, you approach it with a certain degree of fear. You wonder how well it's held up. Sometimes you're pleasantly surprised. You always hope you didn't make a real groaner of a mistake somewhere in between, but I found it kind of fun to look at this because there were some things that I wrote about that I forgot I wrote about. There were some things that kind of tickled me. There were one or two things that made me choke up, just because just little things that I had forgotten along the way. Perhaps it might be interesting for me to tell you a little bit about how I even landed on the topic.
Yeah, I'm very interested. And Carol, let me just, I said Carol, see,
Yeah.
I'm improving. What I forgot to mention to those who are watching, we encourage you to type in the chat box, your questions. You already figured it out that you can't actually ask the question. We muted everybody, but if you have a question, please type it in the little chat box and we will hopefully get to it.
We'll try to get to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Pickett's charge in history and memory actually began as my master's thesis. A number of us were challenged to take a narrative that we pretty much considered to be the accepted narrative about a person, a place, or a thing, and then go back and start peeling back the layers and see if it was in fact like an onion that had several different layers of interpretation. What was the factual core at the center, and then what happened to make it become the whole onion, basically. I had chosen Pickett's charge. I'm a Pennsylvanian. It was something I grew up with. I made my first visit here back in 1960, a long time ago. And I saw, it was something I thought I knew something about. And of course, all of us who spend so much time here, we run into thousands of visitors every year who come here convinced if they don't know about much of anything else, they know about Pickett's charge. So that was the beginning of it. As I grew as a historian, there were certain books that captured my imagination, one of them being John Keegan's Face of Battle. And that's where I picked up on some of the notions about every soldier having his own experience on a battlefield. And then Michael Cannon's Mystic Chords of Memory that came out in the early 1990s had a huge influence on me. And I was real tickled when after the Pickett book came out, I got email from him saying,
Oh, wow.
This is really cool.
Oh, that's nice.
And so that was pretty neat. But it was about the transformation of traditions in American culture. And he actually referenced Pickett's charge as one of the stories along the way. So there was some intellectual input that way. Jen was right when she said historians are late to the memory game. One of the sort of prime articles that got us thinking about it at all didn't come out until 1989. David Thalen wrote an article that appeared in the Journal of American History, which is one of the big foundational journals that professional academic historians keep an eye on. And it was just memory in American history. I mean, very general overview of a new concept that probably we should deliver. And that was 1989. So if you took a look at that book and then, or that article and Michael Cannon's book, okay, I'm going to start taking what I did with Pickett's charge and start thinking in terms of using, applying memory to the concept. And had to give many talks along the way. And some people still sometimes have a little trouble grasping the difference here. And it's useful to make a few comments about it. History, as Jen pointed out, is it's an intellectual force. All the activity goes on up here. It's an intellectual force. It is evidence-based. There's a critical analysis factor to it. And bottom line, what we're trying to go for is objective truth. We hope we get there. Sometimes we're not sure if we do, but as far as we get, it's based on evidence and our critical analysis of it. Memory is more something that comes from the gut. Say, history's up here, gut is either from the heart or from the gut. And it's being driven by emotion, rather than intellect. It's being driven by social agendas, stories your grandfather told you, something else other than evidence-based, the way historians would do it. And usually that helps people make a distinction. Another factor about this book that I found interesting, as I went back and looked at it and realized that when I said Pickett's charge in history and memory, I was actually talking about two different kinds of memory. One is the biological, physiological, neurological process of history that goes, or process of memory that goes on in your head, and how we process different ideas. An interesting book for those of you who like to read some things that are not just about Civil War history is Richard Holmes' book called Acts of War. And one of the things he wrote about in there, and I think somebody mentioned it, he was the one who basically said, we live our lives on the great gray level plane of existence. And what really stays in our memory are those peak experiences that rise above and below. And so that's why we get wonderful things about the Battle of First Bull Run, because it's a first experience for all these soldiers. But you get the book about Petersburg and, you know, been there, done that, you can't separate the two events and that kind of thing. And it began to make a lot of sense. If you take a look at the narrative about Pickett's charge, all those Vermont sources come out and talk about, you know, the great charge that they made in the counterattack and hitting the flank, and it's all this fine detail. Well, those Vermonters are in their first battle.
Right.
For them, it is that unique experience, and they're going to be civilians in a couple of weeks. And it's really kind of fun to read in the National Tribune when the veterans are getting on their case saying, you know, if we allow this to continue, Vermont will have won the whole war by themselves. But you're basically seeing the memory in action and others holding you to the, holding their feet to the fire to say the truth of history will prevail. If you are a subscriber to the Gettysburg magazine, I wish I would have stopped to go back and find when they published it. But you can just as easily go out and tap into the online version of the National Tribune online. Look for an article called The Battle of Podoxburg. It was published by the National Tribune in 1887. And it takes shots at all the people who are trying to make up stories and turn the Pickett's charge story to their own specific ends. Instead of General Meade, it's General Reed. And instead of General Hancock, it's General Peacock. And General Pickles will show up in it as well. But it's written by a veteran of the 107th Oshkosh Volunteers. And it basically says, you know, if my version doesn't agree with yours with history, it's because I got there first and put in his 2 cents. There's an awful lot about the struggle between history and memory that affects a lot of the things that are very topical in today's world. And so if the takeaway from this book is that the two forces are different, one from here and one from here, that can help you make some distinctions in some of the news that we deal with in our own lives. The newspapers we've been hearing about, media spin is not something new to our generation. Media spin was going on back then, they just didn't call it that. So if you want a takeaway, just begin to make those differentiations in your reading and in watching the news and all the information you deal with every day. Where's it coming from, here or here? And I will have done my job.
So Carol, we have a question. Oh, now it's moved on. There it is from Ed Love.
Okay.
Dr. Reardon, thank you. After having reread the book, is there anything that you would change, having a new perspective on the charge?
I wouldn't change anything about the charge itself. I mean, I think that part of it stands out. One of the things that I would change is something that is really for the academic, more for the academic audience rather than for the audience at large. And that is, there's very little theory in the book. And that was because when I started out, there was very little theory to draw on, to be perfectly honest. Now there's all kinds of, when I actually taught a course on historical memory and all that, I would go back to the works of people like Marty Smallbox and Benedict Anderson and people who did things like that, who to a current history graduate student would be, of course, we would go back and I realize for you that meant absolutely nothing for most of you, and that's okay. But, you know, because this is the really arcane nitty gritty stuff of the history geeks and grad stuff. And I would use them, but those weren't even things that were on our radar screens for those of us doing this kind of work at the very beginning. The little I did put in, this is a secret that many of you don't know. When I turned in the manuscript for this book, and I bet all of us who have turned in manuscripts for books before, you're really happy when you get that message back from the publisher that says, "We love this. This is great. We're going to publish it. Now cut it back by 25%. Did you get that one, did? Yeah. This book was supposed to be 25% longer than the one you saw, and a lot of what they took out was the stuff that they thought slowed down the narrative, the theory, and that kind of thing. So from some of my professional reviewers, they said lack of theory, and then I'd have to come back and say, find me some, okay, and kind of go from there. So if I were to change something, I would try to find an artful way to put some of that in again, to kind of bring it back full circle and discharge my intellectual obligations a bit more completely. But other than that, not a whole lot. Let's see.
So let's go to Al Mackey. Al Mackey is undoubtedly wearing a University of Virginia shirt as he typed this.
No, Virginia Tech.
Of course I do that. I was trying to annoy Al. Thank you for ruining the joke on Al. Gosh. Yes, for those of you who don't know, Al is always comes to CWI. He always asks fantastic questions, and he always wants to get on C-SPAN so he can wear his Hokies Virginia Tech shirt, which I knew, but I was trying to tease him, which that of course was ruined. Dr. Reardon can see the question. I will read it. Can everyone at home see the question as well?
No,
they cannot, so I'll need to read it. Getting to the heart of the memory of the charge, how is it the clear defeat of this charge actually wound up being not only a point of pride within Confederate heritage, but also happening over a year after the disaster at Malvern Hill did not significantly affect R.E. Lee's reputation as a military genius both at the time and thereafter?
Well, I think they took, I think the Southerners themselves took and played a major role in that by focusing all the blame on Longstreet. That'll be a great way to divert blame right there. I thought it was interesting when the question says did not significantly affect R.E. Lee's reputation. Remember, Lee will submit his resignation after this battle. It will not be accepted. But one of the things that I wasn't able to talk about quite as much in the book as I would have wanted to is if you took a look at the Richmond newspapers after the battle was over, this was a bit of a trauma for them because this was the first time that Lee's army has been defeated. And it is Lee's army, no question about it. And they are going to have a rather intense discussion about who's to blame. And it's really kind of interesting to see who they pick on and who they do not pick on in the Richmond newspapers right afterwards. One of the people they will pick on will be Jeff Stewart. That's pretty, where was it? Another person who will come under fire will be Richard Ewell for not attacking on the, not continuing the attack on the first day. A third person who will come under some attack, and I always thought it was odd because it seemed like a strange choice, is Richard Anderson, the division commander in A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps, who was helping Longstreet on the second day. A fourth person who will pop up is Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee will come under a considerable amount of criticism and from the Richmond media in all this, but we see that that part's been flushed out. That part's would have been removed by the pro-Lee crowd in the post-war years. You just don't see it. It's certainly there. There is a wonderful article, and it's not just a Southern thing by any stretch. There's a wonderful article in a Northern newspaper called the Blue and Gray. Not Blue and Gray. The Army and Navy Journal. That's what it's called. The Army and Navy Journal. it's about the middle of October, and it's shortly after Lee's after-action report has been published. There's no operational security involved here, it's out there. And so people north and south have been able to read it. And there is a critique of Lee's report in the Army and Navy Journal in October, in which it says, as a report of a major operation, I find this entire report totally unsatisfactory as a report for a major army in a significant military campaign. It does not identify the purpose of the campaign. It does not explain the decisions behind the conduct of it. And it went on, and it was as harsh a critique as you could fit into a one column as I've ever seen. And historians have never tapped into that. Because the Army and Navy Journal is not a commonly used source by Civil War historians. It should be.
But that's a pretty misguided criticism, don't you think?
I don't think so at all.
If Lee had published a report, as they suggested he should have, it would have brought the kind of dissension that he fought against. I mean, yes, I agree that criticism is legit, if that report would have stayed internal. But obviously, say the world's seeing it, and last thing is, we know, Lee never ever wanted to stir controversy within his ranks.
Well, okay, I mean, but, we're not talking about what Lee says to his troops.
Right,
I'm talking about the outside criticism.
Right.
And it's there,
Right.
it's there, but we don't have.
The South Carolina papers went after him pretty hard. In fact, I've never understood this. Davis sent Lee a copy of one of the editorials from one of the Charleston papers. And Lee, again, here's a side that we oversee of Lee. He did not respond very favorably to any of this. In fact, he kind of sulked a little bit and, submitting his resignation. I think, my God.
But then Davis responds with, if not you.
Right,
And kind of goes,
even Lee should have known that, like we understood, right?
But the interesting thing, again, about those, the post-battle criticism is that the name that is not there, as far as who are we blaming for this, is James Longstreet. Longstreet's name will show up once or twice here and there, but this whole notion of Lee and Longstreet butting heads is not part of the immediate post-battle stuff. So it's really kind of interesting to see how all this grows as Lee dies in 1870 and goes on from there.
Carol, I'm going to ask you a quick question here, and then we have a few from the audience as well. One of the things, the takeaways of this book is that your belief is that memory is going to continue to triumph over history. And also another theme of this book is that we see how the lost cause emerges triumphant, and we've heard this from our panelists as well. And so one of the things that I would like for you to address, and even our panelists as well, because they all talk on the battlefield to folks, it seems to me, Carol, that you have sent us all a warning, and a warning that maybe we've not heeded in doing our battlefield tours, that we continue to do what? We continue to talk about this charge from Spangler Woods. We continue to do this within the shadow of the Virginia Monument. We continue to emphasize Lee at the very end of this attack, taking a full blame responsibility for it, when in fact his army was melting away, right? And so we do all that. So here's now the takeaway. Why don't we tonight all agree we're going to start calling it what? Hancock Stand. How about that? And we start doing this thing over on Cemetery Ridge. What's your thoughts about that?
I did a field program on Hancock's defense and said, even more than that, it's Meade's defense.
That's even better.
Okay.
That's even better.
And then went from there. Now, I don't do my Pickett's charge
Oh,
law
you don't?
the way
Okay.
you
I
did,
shouldn't
the way
say
you did it,
that.
okay?
That's right.
Just to show you how much I've taken a lot of this into what I do. Now, I will admit up front, part of this was forced on me by bad knees. When I couldn't quite cross the field anymore, I had to come up with an alternative way to present the program. And so what I started doing was, my first stop on a Pickett's charge program is at the North Carolina Monument. That's where I do my setup for the program. I put the Pettigrew Trimble piece of the action on the ground where they stood. We can see their line of advance. We started there. Depending on the time that I have available to me, sometimes we have to do it from the Virginia Memorial, but I would prefer to take them down to the Spangler Farm, march them up the Spangler Farm Lane and deploy where Pickett's men did, and ask simple questions like, what can you see from here? What can't you see from here? Who can see us? Who can't see us? And I actually asked that question a number of times going across the field because the answers always change and they aren't really the typical ones you see. When you're reading those newspaper accounts, especially northern newspaper accounts, they talk about the field of Pickett's charge as Plaza Parade Ground, and all that sort of thing. And from up there, if you look down, it sort of looks that way. But if you're crossing the ground, and I know a lot of you have, you know, it does one of these things. And the answers to your questions always change. My third stop is over by the Pennsylvania Monument, where you stand behind the guns, the line of guns that Hunt put in place that can inflate the Pickett portion of the attack very clearly. And we can talk about, you know, Wilcox and Lang and their piece of the puzzle. And then, of course, you go up to the angle. But even up at the angle, you stop at different places. Stand down in Norman Hall's part of the line and look to your north, or you look up toward the clump of trees and realize that there is a knob of ground at the clump of trees that prevents you from seeing Hayes's line completely. And when you're standing down there, you can see Pickett's men coming right at you, and you can't see Pettigrew's men at all. And so, okay, you can begin to put yourself in the place of the individual soldier and say, what can I see, what can't I see? And I hope some of you are saying, I gotta try to do this next time I go there. And then, of course, go up to the angle up by the 71st Monument where the wall comes together. Or now you can see Pettigrew's men. I mean, if I have to pick a place I don't want to be, I do not want to be in the line of the Philadelphia Brigade because I can see Pickett and Pettigrew both coming at me. And I would have hated to have been there.
Absolutely.
But that's the way I tend to lead my programs because it helps me build the memory element in. Because then you can stand there and say, what can you see? What's going to stick in your memory when you're talking about those spikes or those other
So briefly, our other panelists, are there things that you do on the battlefield that Pickett's charge that in a sense are influenced by Carroll's book? And also I think all of us here are aware of or sensitive to the dominance of the lost cause and how that can distort our memories. Doug, you want to get us started here? Is there anything that you do your Pickett's charge?
So I guess the thing that I tapped into mostly of what Carol brings in is I'm a big fan of the terrain. These guys aren't idiots. It generally goes with this idea of mostly you got to get the average visitor past. This is crazy.
Right.
It's not crazy.
Right.
You know, we always try and juxtapose this with this, you know, Longstreet offering, you know, this optimal tactical solution of let's sit on high ground and let them attack. Well, that's great, except that doesn't get you to your strategic end, right? There's a strategic imperative here. Everything we do at the tactical level better get us to our strategic end. That doesn't get us there. So this isn't crazy. This is a way to connect that, and that starts to go, wait a minute. Because if you start to ask people, well, what are your options? Can you leave? Well, not really, because then you just lost the largest battle of the war and the first battle of your invasion to win the war. Okay, can you stay on the fence? Well, not really. You don't have supplies to do that. No, by the way, you can't shoot. So then pretty soon they have to make the choice that they're going to attack. It moves it past this idea of this is crazy. And then as you stop along the way, 300 yards, these guys are all going to come together. The precision with which they do this is not slipshod. This is not thrown together. These are real professionals that are truly applying the operational art at trying to achieve it and to try and get them to that point, because most people are disassociated with the military professional and certainly the profession at the time.
Absolutely. Sasha?
Yeah, I guess I would also say, well, two things. In addition to the terrain, which I'm also a big fan of, I don't think you can understand any battlefield without fully walking the terrain, but especially a battlefield that undulates so much as this one does. The power of contingency, which Carol brings up as well, that the fog of war, the chaos, the mistakes that one person can make, or a miscarried order or a non-delivered order can throw off even the best laid plans, and nothing is inevitable. When it comes to this charge, in terms of how it unfolds, in terms of how any of the major points occur, contingency matters. And we have to take those moments into our understanding of how soldiers responded to contingency and experiences that happened that they weren't expecting. The second one is another thing that Carol brought up, which is the power of an individual's previous battle experience in shaping how they not only reacted to the charge itself and the decisions that they made, but then also how they represented the battle afterward, whether it's the Vermonters who are coming in, this is their very first fight, whether it's soldiers who had fought both on July 1st and July 2nd, who are now being asked to fight again on July 3rd, they're going to have a very different idea of this battle than, say, Pickett's men, who are coming in for the first time at Gettysburg. Some men who have experienced much heavier fighting earlier in the battle, either on the 1st or the 2nd, as Carol mentions in her book, they perceive what goes on at Pickett's charge as really, no great shakes. They mentioned that in their report, like, oh yeah, we marched across the field and we were repulsed and then we retreated. But to them, other parts of the battle were so much more important and so much more horrific. And also the regionality of certain soldiers, if they've been in huge battles before, like Gaines Mill or Malvern Hill, this is more familiar to them, obviously, than your green soldier, but also to soldiers who are not participating in the battle itself, but are from the Western Theater in Vicksburg, or who had seen Shiloh before, some of the big Western battles. To them, those are the battles that matter, not Pickett's charge in Gettysburg. They don't see this as necessarily the turning point. They have a completely different frame of reference for understanding Pickett's charge in Gettysburg. So that individual personal baggage is kind of what I always refer to it as in tours at the Richmond battlefield. That matters, and how people understood what they were participating in, and then how they represented it for future generations.
Jen, do you have some comments here?
Yeah, I have a comment about Hancock's repulse, and I think,
Or Hancock's stand.
Hancock's stand. I think what Carol's book does, and hopefully we all can think about this in our own lives, is look at how much Pickett's charge is embedded in our collective consciousness. And it's in the cyclorama. The cyclorama that was done by Paul Philippotteau is a story of Pickett's charge. The Park Service construction of the Visitor Center on Cemetery Hill in Mission 66 was deliberately placed there to capitalize on the story of Pickett's charge. In the movie Gettysburg, it's like an hour-and-a-half scene that was done. It was about Pickett's charge. You make a comment in the last chapter about how it's in our Civil War art. So much of the artists depict Pickett's charge. So it's very much, this is the attack that defines the American Civil War. Whether rightly or wrongly, that's what it's made out to be in our memory, collective memory.
So, Jill, if you don't mind, I'd like to have the last question for Dr. Reardon here, right there, if you don't mind. And it is from Brian, is it question? Yeah, I'll just read the question. As a layman, it often seems historical memory studies are just a compilation of anecdotal first-person accounts. How do we know when the author is using these accounts to just develop a thesis rather than just picking accounts to create a narrative?
That's a dynamite
Well, that's
question.
a tough question.
It's a tough one, but it's a
It's
dynamite
an important
question.
one, absolutely.
I think you're appealing straight to the very core of historical methodology.
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, I think what you're talking about, that is a tendency that's very easy for us to fall into, especially if the quotations are wonderful and I want to know the story behind it or something like that. But one of the things that became awfully important in writing this book was, first of all, taking a look at how close the account was that I'm reading, what was to the actual action.
Right.
Where there weren't a whole lot of other filters it had to go through before they put it on paper or put it or went to press with it. Some of it requires you to take the account and go and stand on the ground. And basically say, could this person have seen what they wrote about? And sometimes the answer is no. And other times you have to put yourself in the individual's shoes. I mean, we don't know how many Confederate cannons were firing at Cemetery Ridge on July 3rd. But there is I've seen several books that will say that there were precisely 157 cannons. Okay, that's dynamite. I mean, where did they get that 157 cannons? Follow the footnotes and it goes back to a soldier written by a corporal, infantry, Yankee, who just wrote a letter on the 6th of July who said basically the Confederates started bombarding us with 157 cannons all aimed directly at me. I mean, it was wonderful hyperbole and he did get wounded by one of them and all that, but somehow that became the foundation for something expressed as fact. And that kind of thing happens all the time. And some of those things you simply should not take as fact at all, but simply as a way, except as a way for a soldier to tell us how he was feeling about something. Somebody asked me what did I find in the book that I had forgotten about? And I really hadn't forgotten about it. I just forgot how moving it was. There was a letter written by Captain Owen of the 18th Virginia that he wrote on Christmas Eve to his family, Christmas Eve, 1863. And he kept talking about a nightmare that he had recurringly, how he was on the field of Gettysburg. And he kept, he was going through the smoke and he saw heights above him that looked like the Cemetery Ridge. It was like going through Pickett's charge again. And he was having an attack of what today we would probably call survivor's guilt. because he was one of the few officers in his regiment that came out unscathed. Why did good and better men than me survive and I did, or die and I did not? And I mean, first of all, it reminds us that combat is trauma, and trauma has an impact on memory and many other parts of our lives. It helps us to respect the combat experience even more, and it should help us to treat the resources that are the product of that trauma, the diaries, the letters, almost the immediate accounts that come out with a lot more respect than we sometimes give them. And so what you're asking is a pretty loaded question, but it speaks to the heart of what we do. Jen's comment about us coming to memory late is an important thing. It is an important comment to make, and it's awfully important that all of us, as we write Civil War military history, be more open to what goes on in other areas of the study of military history, so that we have the best grasp that we possibly can have on what the trauma of combat can do to the sources that we use to build the histories we write for you.
Dr. Reardon, that's a perfect way for us to end, and I'm glad you mentioned that Henry Owen letter. It is one of the most poignant letters when he recounts the dream that he had for his wife. It really is a pretty amazing letter. And so thank you again, not just for sharing that anecdote, but for sharing with us your reflections upon this very important book. Also, let me thank all the panelists as well. But I just want to say one final thing about Dr. Reardon. You know, the Academy gets a bad rap, I think, that we are unwilling or even just disinterested in reaching out to public audiences. And Dr. Reardon, from day one, has reached out to a wide range of audiences, and we're not just talking about the folks who are watching tonight. She has done countless staff rides. She's been integral to the advancement of military education on Civil War battlefields. She's been president of the Society of Military History twice, I believe, the very first woman to be president as well. She has, on so many different levels, and not just her scholarship, teaching, or touring, all these things, she has made a profound difference. And we just have to know, man, we got 2 women on this panel. I'm telling you, what, 15 years ago, you'd have been hard pressed to been able to find women who have in places like this, right? And it's in large part because Carol was a path-breaking work, right? And it showed women, hey, you know what? You don't have to go to grad school and do gender history. You can do it if you like, but we're not going to pigeonhole you in that, but you don't have to do it. So, you know, Carol, thank you again so much for this book. Thank you so much for what you've done for the field. And a little advertisement. She's going to be with us. I think you said yes. 2022. Yep. We're going to do a panel for CWI 2022 with Jeffrey Words, Gary Gallagher, and Dr. Reardon on James Longstreet. That should be pretty dull, I think.
Yeah.
That's one of the ones you want to skip, right?
I would, except I'm on it.
You're on it.
Thank you, Pete.
Yes, no, thank you. Thank you all so much again. I appreciate you all coming this evening. We're going to take about almost a 15-minute break, just a little bit less than that. Is there anything, Ashley, that I failed to mention before the break? Yeah, are we good?
I don't think so. No, we just, next panel coming up, and then Jill will keep typing in the discount codes for the books and the reminder about our October fall field program registration in case you missed it.
All right, you all good. We'll see you in about 15 minutes. Thank you so much.